Today's video is going to look at the Naval Museum in Cartagena, Spain. Cartagena is one of the oldest settlements in Spain, having been originally set up by the Carthaginians as part of the huge empire that ran along the southern edge of the Mediterranean. It has many sites of historical and interest, starting with the Naval Museum, which is on the seafront. Not far inland from it is the Military Museum, which is housed in an old barracks that also serves as the local municipal archives. As befits a place that eventually became a Roman settlement, there is also a Roman theatre with associated tunnels. Nearby is a section of the city wall that was built during the reign of Carlos III. With those with more modern interests, there's a Civil War Air Museum, which you can reach by going up a long spiral staircase in a tower or using the lift. There is also the National Underwater Archaeology Museum, which is of great interest to anybody who enjoys that aspect of history. The museum itself is housed in one of the older buildings that form part of the original naval base. It is shared with the local university or polytechnic. The entrance is guarded by two large anchors, and on entering, you are greeted by a model of the Spanish sail training ship, the Juan Elcano. If you turn to the right, you will follow the trail through the museum, which is in fact a hollow square. But make sure that you don't miss what is to the left, which is an example of some wonderful paintings of personalities and events of recent and past times of the Spanish Navy. There's also a gun carriage which was used to transport the body of Alfonso XIII to his funeral. On turning to the right, the first section you reach looks at naval construction and contains a huge selection of wonderful model ships. It starts with sailing ships and includes oared galleys and galleasses. There is an example of a medieval cog, the type of ship that was used by the nations and towns that formed the Hanseatic League and was very popular in Northern Europe during the medieval period. There are examples of galleons and xebecs, a store ship, and a very interesting bomb vessel, the Santa Rosa de Lima, which is unusual in that it has two mortars side by side, unlike the one in the bomb ship La Candelaria, which only has one. There's examples of both large and small gun launches, and some of the later galleons, such as the San Martin. Amongst the galleys, there is the La Real and the Soledad. Interestingly, if you go to Barcelona's Naval Museum, you can see a recreation of La Real in one of the halls. The Santísima Trinidad, of course, was one of the largest ships ever built for the Spanish Navy and was captured and destroyed at the Battle of Trafalgar. Spain had its ironclads, including the armoured frigate Numancia and the Vittoria. The battleship Palau was actually built in France and was unfortunately unable to take part in the Spanish-American War as it was in harbour being refitted and repaired at the time. There are examples of models of some of the cruisers used by the Spanish Navy during the 18th century, including the Infanta Maria Teresa, which was sunk by the Americans, and the Reina Regente, which sank in a very tragic accident during a heavy storm. There is also a model of the battleship España, which was one of a class of 3 ships and was the smallest dreadnought built by any of the nations. This ship is of particular interest to me. I always find its design very simple, elegant, and very attractive. The ship was built in Ferrol in northwestern Spain to a design that incorporated many weapons that were designed by Vickers Armstrong, who were part owners of the shipyard in which she was built. American influence was quite important in the Spanish Navy, particularly after the Second World War, and this can be seen in the fact that one of the Fletcher-class destroyers, the Converse, actually became the Almirante Valdez. The destroyer, Roger de Laurier, is Spanish in design, but its armament is almost exclusively American. This patrol boat is based on a German design. The small aircraft carrier, the Príncipe de Asturias, was actually based on an American design for a sea control ship or small aircraft carrier. The Americans never built one, but the Spanish did, and it served them very well until it was withdrawn from service some years ago. The next section of the museum looks at navigation and navigational equipment. There are many examples of different sorts of navigation equipment and control equipment that will be fitted to a ship's bridge. These include a number of binnacles, which contain magnetic compasses. The green and red shapes are actually pieces of metal which are used to move in and out to affect the compass to make sure that it always points to due north. The next section deals with naval artillery, but actually concentrates more on smaller weapons, although there are some examples of cannons. There are also cases of the sort of small arms used by the Spanish armed forces. This is a Russian-made Maxim gun. captured during the Spanish Civil War. It was later used by the Spanish Army. This Krupp landing gun was actually used to transport the body of Alfonso XIII at his funeral. The following section looks at naval health or naval sanitation. The rather tortuous-looking instrument in the middle, which looks like a cage, is actually a form of shower. There are many cases of the sort of medical equipment that would have been used on board ship. After that section, there is a section that looks at the various flags and uniforms worn by the Spanish Navy. It's interesting to note how the Spanish naval ensign has changed over the years, and how each flotilla and sometimes each ship would have its own particular flag. Along one wall is a very long diorama. This diorama, which is made up with 54mm scale soldiers, shows the funeral procession of Alfonso XIII. In the bottom photo, you can actually see the Krupp field gun and carriage being used to transport his coffin. There are numerous examples of various uniforms as worn by the Spanish Navy and some of its political organizations. These include a complete band and an escort of armed sailors. There is a section in the museum which is dedicated to Isaac Peral, who was one of the pioneer submarine builders and designers. He was local to Cartagena, and it's no coincidence that Cartagena remains to this day the main submarine base for the Spanish Navy. Around the walls of the exhibit are numerous examples of drawings of his submarine designs. And in the centre is a model of his pioneering submarine design, which is named after him, the Peral. There's also a section that looks at the submarines operated by the Spanish Navy. This section contains numerous models of submarines that were used by various times by the Spanish Navy. The B-class and C-class submarines saw active service during the Spanish Civil War. After the Second World War, as we've seen before, American influence on the Spanish Navy became quite important. And this can be seen in the example here of the USS Kraken, a US submarine which was taken over by the Spanish and used by them with the name Almirante Garcia de los Reyes. However, the French then began to exercise a degree of influence over future Spanish submarine designs, and they actually built, under license, both the S-60 and S-70 classes before moving on to their own design of the S-80. There's also a section that looks at diving, and it includes examples of both old-fashioned and modern deep diving suits, as well as an example of a two-man mini submarine, very similar to that is featured in one of the Tintin books. There's also an example of a semi-submersible canoe used by Spanish Special Forces. There is also a decompression chamber of the sort used by divers when returning to or going on deep dives. The final section of this part of the museum looks at mine warfare and anti-submarine warfare, and also includes an example of an early Whitehead torpedo that was built out of bronze, and the sort of torpedo tube that would have been used to fire it. There is a very interesting display that explains about the various methods of minesweeping. Anti-submarine warfare is represented by two different weapon systems. Here, a depth charge, or in this case a depth bomb, which is mounted on its thrower, and a hedgehog, a head-throwing anti-submarine weapon. This fired a pattern of mortar bombs ahead of a ship that was trying to attack a submarine head-on, and they would explode on contact. This was actually a very effective anti-submarine weapon and was developed and used during the latter part of the Second World War. On leaving the main body of the museum, it's very easy to miss the next section, which is actually in a separate hall nearby. And this contains the Pearl submarine. As you can see, its design is cigar shape. And at one end there is a torpedo tube, which in this case has been capped off. At the other end, there are twin rudders and twin thrusting propellers. The submarine is unusual and it actually has thrusters both at front and rear to help her go up and down. The conning tower contains glass blocks that you can use to con the submarine when it's on the surface, but it also has several periscopes so that when it's submerged, the officer commanding can see where the submarine actually is in relation to its surroundings. That is a brief survey of the Naval Museum in Cartagena, and I thoroughly recommend that anybody going to Spain, to that part of Spain, visit it if you have the opportunity. If you've liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already joined or subscribed, please think about it. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Goodbye.